The sun was just beginning to rise over the rolling hills of Greenfield Valley, casting a golden hue over the sprawling acres of the Thompson family farm. For over a century, the Thompsons had tended to this land, passing it down from generation to generation. It was more than just a farm. It was a legacy, a testament to the hard work and dedication of those who had come before. John Thompson, a rugged man in his late 40s, stood on the porch of the farmhouse, sipping his morning coffee. He had inherited the farm from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. The farm was his life, his pride, and his responsibility. It was also his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the chaos of the modern world and connect with the land that had sustained his family for generations. But that peace was about to be shattered. John had heard rumors about the new development going up just a few miles down the road. Oak Ridge Heights, they were calling it. A sprawling suburban community complete with McMansions, manicured lawns, and a homeowners association, HOA, that seemed to have a rule for everything. John had never paid much attention to the development. After all, his farm was zoned for agricultural use, and his deed explicitly stated that his property was exempt from any HOA jurisdiction. He had nothing to worry about her, so he thought. It was a crisp autumn morning when John first met Margaret Hayes, the president of the Oak Ridge Heights HOA. She arrived in a sleek black SUV, her designer sunglasses perched on her perfectly coiffed hair. She stepped out of the vehicle, her high heels sinking into the soft earth of John's driveway. "Mr. Thompson, I presume," she said, her voice dripping with faux politeness. "That's me," John replied, his tone cautious. He had heard stories about Margaret Hayes. She was known for her iron-fisted control over the Oak Ridge Heights community, enforcing rules with a zeal that bordered on obsession. "I'm Margaret Hayes, president of the Oak Ridge Heights HOA. I wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood," she said, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Thanks, but I've been here for over 40 years, John replied, his voice steady. "This farm has been in my family for generations." Margaret's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Yes, well, times are changing. We're trying to create a cohesive community here, and that means everyone needs to follow the same rules." John crossed his arms over his chest. "My property is zoned for agricultural use. Your HOA has no jurisdiction here." Margaret's smile turned icy. "We'll see about that." The first sign of trouble came a week later. John woke up to find that several of his cows had been spooked during the night. They had broken through a section of the fence and wandered into the neighboring field. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, but this time, the consequences were far more severe. John received a letter from the Oak Ridge Heights HOA demanding that he repair the fence immediately and pay a fine for allowing livestock to roam freely, creating a nuisance for the community. John was furious. He had already planned to repair the fence, but the idea of paying a fine to an HOA that had no authority over his property was absurd. He called Margaret Hayes to set the record straight. "Margaret, this is ridiculous. My property is exempt from your HOA. You have no right to fine me," John said, his voice tight with anger. Margaret's tone was calm, almost smug. "Mr. Thompson, the HOA has jurisdiction over all properties within the Oak Ridge Heights development. Your farm may be zoned for agricultural use, but that doesn't mean you're exempt from our rules." John clenched his fist. "I have the deed to this property, and it clearly states that my land is grandfathered in. Your HOA has no authority here." Margaret's voice turned cold. "We'll see about that." The next few weeks were a nightmare. John received daily letters from the HOA, each one more threatening than the last. They accused him of violating a litany of rules, from the height of his fence to the type of crops he was growing. Each letter demanded that he pay a fine or face legal action. John knew he was in the right, but he also knew that fighting the HOA would be expensive and time-consuming. He decided to consult a lawyer, a woman named Sarah Reynolds who specialized in property disputes. Sarah reviewed John's documents and immediately saw the problem. "John, you're absolutely right. Your property is exempt from the HOA's jurisdiction, but it looks like they're trying to bully you into submission. They're hoping you'll give up and sell. John's jaw tightened. I'm not selling. This farm is my life. Sarah nodded. Then we'll fight them. But it's not going to be easy. They have deep pockets, and they're not afraid to play dirty. The first act of sabotage came on a cold November night. John woke up to the sound of his dogs barking furiously. He grabbed his shotgun and ran outside, only to find that someone had cut through the fence surrounding his pasture. Several of his cows had wandered out, and one had been hit by a car on the nearby road. John was devastated. The cow was one of his best milk producers, and losing her was a significant financial blow. But what was worse was the realization that someone had deliberately sabotaged his property. He called the sheriff, but there was little they could do. Without any evidence, it was impossible to prove who had cut the fence. But John had his suspicions. The next morning, he received another letter from the HOA, this time accusing him of negligence for allowing his livestock to roam freely. The letter demanded that he pay for the damage to the car that had hit his cow, as well as a fine for endangering the community. John was livid. He knew that Margaret Hayes and the HOA were behind the sabotage, but he had no proof. He decided to install security cameras around his property, hoping to catch the culprits in the act. It didn't take long for the cameras to pay off. A few nights later, John was woken up by the sound of his security alarm. He grabbed his shotgun and ran outside, only to find two men in hooded sweatshirts tampering with his fence. John shouted at them, and they took off running. He didn't catch them, but the cameras had captured everything. The footage clearly showed the men cutting the fence and then running towards a black SUV parked nearby. John took the footage to the sheriff, but once again, there was little they could do. The men's faces were obscured by their hoods, and the SUV's license plate was covered. But John had a feeling that Margaret Hayes was behind it. He decided to confront her. He drove to the Oak Ridge Heights Community Center, where the HOA was holding a meeting. He barged into the room, the security footage playing on his phone. "Margaret, I know you're behind this," John said, his voice shaking with anger. "You think you can bully me into selling, but I'm not going anywhere." Margaret's face turned red with anger. "How dare you accuse me of such a thing? You have no proof." John held up his phone. "I have footage of your goons sabotaging my property. You can deny it all you want, but I know the truth." The room erupted into chaos. Some of the HOA members looked shocked, while others seemed nervous. Margaret tried to regain control, but the damage had been done. The next day, John received a call from a local reporter named Melissa Ramirez. She had heard about the confrontation at the HOA meeting and wanted to investigate further. John agreed to meet with her, and over the next few weeks, they uncovered a web of corruption that went far beyond Margaret Hayes and the HOA. They discovered that the Oak Ridge Heights development was part of a larger plan by a corporate real estate company called Meridian Development Group. The company had been buying up land in the area, using the HOA as a front to pressure homeowners into selling. John's farm was just one piece of the puzzle. Meridian had plans to build a massive commercial complex in the area, and they needed John's land to make it happen. Melissa published a series of articles exposing the corruption, and soon the story was picked up by national media. The pressure on the HOA and Meridian Development Group became too much to bear, and both organizations were forced to back down. In the end, John was able to keep his farm. The HOA was disbanded, and Margaret Hayes was forced to resign. Meridian Development Group faced multiple lawsuits, and several of their executives were indicted on charges of fraud and conspiracy. John's farm became a symbol of resistance against corporate greed and corruption. He expanded his operations, adding a farm-to-table program that became wildly popular with the local community. The new HOA, now run by a group of homeowners committed to transparency and fairness, even featured John's farm in their community newsletter. But the victory came at a cost. John had spent months fighting for his land, and the stress had taken a toll on his health. He knew that he couldn't have done it without the support of his neighbors and the local community. As he stood on his porch, watching the sun rise over his fields, John felt a sense of pride and relief. He had fought for his land, his legacy, and his way of life. And in the end, he had won. But he also knew that the fight wasn't over. There would always be those who sought to exploit the land for profit, and it was up to people like him to stand up and protect it. As his grandfather used to say, good fences make good neighbors, but only when those fences are built on honesty, respect, and true community values. 6 months later, John received an unexpected VY citer. It was Margaret Hayes, but she looked nothing like the confident, domineering woman he had known. Her hair was disheveled, and her eyes were red from crying. John, I need to apologize, she said, her voice trembling. I was wrong. I let greed and power cloud my judgment. I lost sight of what was important. John was taken aback. He had never expected to hear those words from Margaret Hayes. I know I can't undo the damage I've done, she continued, but I want to make amends. I've been working with the authorities to expose the corruption at Meridian Development Group. I hope that by doing so, I can help prevent others from going through what you went through. John nodded slowly. It's not easy to admit when you're wrong, Margaret, but I appreciate your apology, and I hope that you can find a way to make things right. Margaret handed him a sealed envelope. This contains information about other properties that Meridian was targeting. I hope it helps. John took the envelope, feeling a sense of closure. The battle had been long and hard, but in the end, justice had prevailed. As he watched Margaret drive away, John felt a renewed sense of hope. The fight had changed him, but it had also strengthened his resolve. He knew that as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, the land would be safe. And that was a legacy worth fighting for. John stood on his porch, holding the envelope Margaret had given him. The weight of it felt heavy in his hands, not just physically, but emotionally. He knew that opening it would mean DVYing back into the mess he had just fought so hard to escape. But he also knew that if there were others out there being targeted by Meridian Development Group, he couldn't turn a blind eye. Inside the envelope were detailed documents, property records, emails, and even financial transactions that revealed Meridian's plans to acquire several other farms and homes in the surrounding counties. The names of the targeted property owners were listed, along with notes on how the company planned to pressure them into selling. Some were elderly widows, others were disabled veterans, and a few were young families who had inherited their land. All of them were vulnerable, just as John had been. John immediately called Sarah Reynolds, his attorney. We need to get this information to the authorities, he said, and we need to warn these people before it's too late. Sarah agreed, and together they began reaching out to the property owners on the list. Many of them were already feeling the pressure, strange fines, sudden zoning changes, and even acts of sabotage similar to what John had experienced. Some had already given up, selling their properties at a fraction of their value. But others were still holding on, unaware of the larger scheme of play. One of the names on the list was an elderly woman named Clara Bennett, who lived just a few miles down the road. Clara's farm had been in her family for over a century, and she had no intention of selling. But over the past few months, she had been receiving threatening letters from the HOA of a nearby development, accusing her of violating various rules. Her fence had been vandalized, and her well had mysteriously gone dry. John drove over to Clara's farm that afternoon. When he arrived, he found her sitting on her porch, her face etched with worry. She was a small woman, frail, but with a fierce determination in her eyes. Clara, my name's John Thompson, he said, introducing himself. I think we've got a common enemy. Clara listened intently as John explained what he had uncovered about Meridian Development Group and their tactics. By the time he finished, her hands were trembling with anger. I knew something wasn't right, she said, but I didn't know who to turn to. They've been making my life a living hell. John handed her a copy of the documents Margaret had given him. You're not alone, Clara. We're going to fight this together. Over the next few weeks, John and Sarah organized a coalition of property owners who had been targeted by Meridian. They held meetings at John's farm, sharing stories and strategies. The group included Clara Bennett, a disabled veteran named Tom Harris, and a young couple, Emily and Jake Morrison, who had inherited their land from Jake's grandparents. Together, they pooled their resources and hired a private investigator to dig deeper into Meridian's operations. What they uncovered was shocking. The company had been using shell companies to buy up properties at below-market prices, then flipping them for massive profits. They had also been bribing local officials to fast-track zoning changes and suppress any opposition. The coalition decided to take their findings to the media. Melissa Ramirez, the reporter who had helped expose the corruption in Oak Ridge Heights, was more than willing to help. She published a series of articles that quickly gained national attention. The story of small-town property owners fighting back against a corporate giant resonated with people across the country. The pressure on Meridian Development Group became overwhelming. Investors began pulling out, and the company's stock plummeted. Law enforcement agencies launched investigations into the company's practices, and several executives were indicted on charges of fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. The climax came during a public hearing at the county courthouse. The coalition, led by John and Sarah, presented their EVY Denke to a panel of judges and local officials. The room was packed with reporters, property owners, and concerned citizens. Margaret Hayes was there too, sitting in the back of the room. She had agreed to testify against Meridian in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony was damning. She revealed how the company had used the HOA as a front to pressure property owners into selling, and how they had bribed officials to manipulate zoning laws. When it was John's turn to speak, he stood tall, his voice steady. "This isn't just about my farm, or Clara's or Tom's. This is about the soul of our community. It's about standing up to those who would exploit us for profit. We're not just fighting for our land, we're fighting for our future." The judges were visibly moved by the testimony. After hours of deliberation, they ruled in favor of the coalition. Meridian Development Group was ordered to cease all operations in the area, and the properties they had acquired through fraudulent means were returned to their rightful owners. The VY Tory was bittersweet. While the coalition had won the battle, the war had taken its toll. Many of the property owners had spent their life SAVY-NGS on legal fees, and some had lost their homes before the truth came to light. But there was also a sense of hope and unity that hadn't been there before. John's farm became a symbol of resilience. He expanded his operations, turning part of his land into a community garden where neighbors could grow their own food. The new HOA, now run by a group of homeowners committed to transparency and fairness, even featured John's farm in their community newsletter. Clara Bennett's farm was restored to its former glory, and she became a local hero, known for her courage and determination. Tom Harris used his settlement money to start a nonprofit organization that helped disabled veterans keep their homes. Emily and Jake Morrison opened a small farm-to-table restaurant, using ingredients grown on their land. As for Margaret Hayes, she served a short prison sentence, but emerged a changed woman. She began working with consumer protection agencies to identify and stop predatory real estate practices. In a strange twist of fate, she and John became unlikely allies, working together to ensure that no one else would fall victim to the kind of corruption they had fought against. Years later, John stood on his porch, watching the sun rise over his fields. The farm was thriving, and the community was stronger than ever. The fight had changed him, but it had also given him a renewed sense of purpose. As he sipped his coffee, he thought about his grandfather's words, "Good fences make good neighbors." But he had learned that it wasn't just about the fence, it was about the values they represented: honesty, respect, and a commitment to doing what was right. The ordeal had taught him that true community wasn't about enforcing arbitrary rules or chasing profits. It was about standing together, protecting each other, and preserving the things that mattered most. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, John felt a sense of peace. The fight was over, but the legacy of what they had accomplished would live on. And that, he realized, was the greatest VY Tory of all. If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this VY Deo with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next VY Deo.